As the dreadnought race began to heat up toward the conclusion of the 1900s, it became clear that more and more of the Royal Navy's main strength would need to be concentrated in home waters to meet the threat of the rising German Navy. With the rapid production of new vessels of all sizes that were leaving the scattering of older ships usually used on distant stations hopelessly obsolete, a number of proposals were put forward. The one that gained Admiralty approval was that of the so-called Fleet Unit, a force notionally made up of a battlecruiser, 3 light cruisers, a half-flotilla of destroyers, and 3 submarines. This off-the-shelf miniature navy would have enough firepower and mobility to deal with any conceivable commerce raiding threat, up to and including formations like Germany's East Asia Squadron. The Royal Navy would operate some, and the wealthier dominions would purchase others and run them as their own navies, although these would come under Royal Navy control and be formed into larger units in the event of a global war, if this was required. As it turned out, Canada and South Africa decided not to actually fund theirs. New Zealand could only afford to buy a battlecruiser for the Royal Navy, and so Australia became the only nation to actually acquire a fleet unit. The core of this force was a modified Indefatigable class battlecruiser that would be named HMAS Australia. Whilst several better choices of capital ship were available, and indeed HMS Lion and Princess Royal were laid down before Australia, they also cost about a third more. In any case, the keel was laid down on the 23rd of June 1910 at John Brown's Yard on the Clyde in Scotland. She was launched in October 1911 and commissioned in early summer 1913, the result of a few delays during construction. Broadly, the ship was a repeat of Indefatigable, but with a few improvements. Communications were centralised, and the station in question was thus enlarged. The forward turret was given its own rangefinder and the capability to direct the entire main battery should the main spotting positions be knocked out. Deck armour around the main armament was increased from 2 to 2.5 inches, although the turtleback deck armour was generally made thinner to compensate. The main belt was shortened slightly, meaning that the extreme ends were unprotected, but whereas Indefatigable had 6-inch amidships armour and then 4 inches over the fore and aft main armament, Australia used the saved weight to increase the 4-inch plate to 5 inches. Still not actually quite as good as the preceding Invincible class, but it at least meant that enemy armoured cruisers would have to get to under 10,000 yards before penetrating the main magazines were possible. Whilst heading for completion, attempts were made to divert her to serve in British waters from the start, but Admiral King Hall and Admiral Patty of the Royal Australian Navy ensured that this did not occur. The ship then sailed for its new home at the end of July 1913, with a crew that was about half Australian and half British. She reached Australia in early October and met up with 2 out of the 3 light cruisers and 3 out of the 6 destroyers that would now form the core of the Royal Australian Navy. Upon arrival in Sydney, the formation formally took up the role of Defence of Australia from the Royal Navy's Australia Squadron, whose ships could now be redeployed elsewhere. The brief period from this point until the outbreak of World War I was spent visiting various Australian ports, but with the outbreak of hostilities, she came back under Royal Navy control. Her simple existence forced Admiral von Spee first to pull all of his ships except for Emden back to Qingdao, before deciding to hightail it across the Pacific to eventually fight at Coronel and the Falkland Islands. In the immediate absence of any major enemies, the Australia led a combined Allied task force in hoovering up the various German Pacific colonies. When it became clear that von Spee was off the coast of South America, she then led a force to cut off any attempt by the Germans to head for the Panama Canal or the west coast of Canada, with HMS Princess Royal waiting in the Caribbean on the other side of the Panama Canal to finish off any survivors. Following the destruction of the East Asia Squadron, Australia was sent to the Caribbean as Princess Royal was recalled home, but the further absence of any German warships in the region, plus the Battle of Dogger Bank, meant that she was diverted to British home waters in early 1915 whilst en route to the Caribbean. Here she was made flagship of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron and took part in a number of sweeps and other operations until on the 22nd of April 1916 she collided with her sister ship HMS New Zealand. Coming off somewhat the worse of the 2 vessels, she completed repairs on the morning of the Battle of Jutland, but as she was in Devonport on the UK's southwestern coast, she was unable to get up to Scapa in time to take part in the battle. Although her return to duty on the 3rd of June at least compensated somewhat for the loss of Indefatigable a few days earlier. The rest of the war was spent training and patrolling, with little excitement except for colliding with HMS Repulse and the fitting of a few anti-aircraft guns and a couple of aircraft, which could be launched off the top of the ship's turrets where takeoff ramps had been fitted. The end of the war saw the ship return home, but she was effectively placed in reserve in mid-1920 due to budget cuts in the Royal Australian Navy and the lack of any opponents worthy of her guns in the Pacific. With the Washington Naval Treaty earmarking her for disposal, she was stripped of anything considered useful before being taken out to sea on the 12th of April 1924 and scuttled at 14:30 hours. The suspected location of the wreck was rediscovered in 1990, before being finally confirmed as the battlecruiser in 2007.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.